You walk into the Marx household, where the smell of candle wax and ink fills the study. Karl's father sits by the desk explaining law and philosophy to his son, who listens with wide, curious eyes. Trier, though peaceful on the surface, is a place touched by change. The Napoleonic Wars have ended, but the French ideas of liberty and equality still linger. Karl grows up in a Jewish family that converts to Christianity, a decision made more for survival than belief. Historians still argue whether that conversion left a quiet wound in young Karl, one that shaped his lifelong sense of rebellion against systems that force people to conform. As a child, Karl is intense and imaginative. He reads poetry and loves stories about heroes who fight against injustice. In school, he often gets into trouble for arguing with teachers about logic or fairness. One teacher later recalled how the boy could not accept an answer just because it was written in a book. He needed to debate it, to pull it apart. A well-known fact is that by the time he was a teenager, Karl had already written poems so passionate that friends thought he might become a poet instead of a philosopher. You stroll with him through the vineyards near Trier, the sun warm on your face, and you can sense the restlessness building inside him. The city is calm, but Karl's mind is not. His father encourages him to study hard, to aim for a stable career, perhaps in law. But Karl is more drawn to questions of meaning, why people obey, why nations rise and fall, and why suffering seems so unevenly spread. One quirky detail that few mention is how young Karl loved pranks. He once organized a mock duel among friends using wooden sticks, all to prove a point about honor being an illusion created by pride. The laughter that followed didn't erase his point. He already saw how social customs could be traps. At home, his parents' relationship shows him two sides of life. His father's rational optimism and his mother's emotional strength. They want him to be safe, to fit into society, yet Karl feels drawn to challenge it. His father's library becomes his playground. You can almost feel the smooth pages under his fingers as he opens books on Voltaire, Rousseau, and Kant. Their ideas ignite a fire inside him that will never go out. Trier itself begins to feel small. You walk with Karl down narrow lanes, past workers returning from the fields, their hands calloused, their faces tired. He watches them closely. He doesn't yet know the word capitalism, but he already senses the unfairness of how the world is arranged. Sometimes he stays up late, writing by candlelight, his thoughts racing faster than his pen. There's a sense of destiny forming, though no one sees it yet. The boy who challenges his teachers and debates his father will soon challenge entire governments. But for now, he's still just Karl, dreamer, thinker, mischief maker, searching for the shape of truth in a world that seems so uneven. You can almost hear the faint sound of the river flowing nearby, steady and indifferent, as if time itself is watching this curious child grow into someone who will one day question everything. The light fades over Trier, and you sit quietly with that feeling, something beginning, something restless, a voice forming in the mind of a boy who will not stay silent. You follow Karl as he leaves Trier behind, stepping into the next chapter of his restless journey. The year is 1835, and he's just 16, full of ambition and curiosity. You can almost hear the sound of a train whistle. Though trains aren't yet common in Germany, travel then means horse-drawn coaches and long, bumpy roads. Karl sets off for the University of Bonn, eager to study law like his father wants, but secretly craving something deeper. At Bonn, life hits him fast. The city is alive with students who talk politics late into the night, drink beer in smoky taverns, and join dueling clubs just to prove their courage. You sit beside Karl at a long wooden table, the air thick with pipe smoke, as he debates with his friends about philosophy and freedom. The professors talk about obedience to the state, but the students talk about revolution. Karl is brilliant, but easily distracted. He spends more time writing poetry and arguing in cafes than attending lectures. His grades begin to slide. Historians still argue whether this was youthful rebellion or the early sign of his struggle to live within limits. A well-known fact is that he joined a student group called the Poets Club, a gathering of dreamers and radicals who mixed romanticism with protest. You can picture him, gesturing passionately, his dark eyes alive as he recites verses about love, fate, and truth. But there's tension too. Karl gets into trouble after a wild night when a fellow student challenges him to a duel. He accepts. Of course, his pride won't allow otherwise. The next morning, in a quiet field, swords clash briefly, and Karl walks away with a small cut on his eyebrow and a bruised ego. It's a harmless scar, but it becomes a quiet reminder of how passion and pride often rule him. His father, worried by reports from Bonn, sends stern letters urging him to focus. You can almost see Heinrich's disappointment in those tidy lines of ink. He wants his son to be respectable, not reckless. So, after just a year, Karl transfers to the University of Berlin, where the tone shifts completely. Berlin is colder, stricter, more intellectual. The moment you arrive, you feel the difference. No more wild student parties here. Minds sharpen against each other in long, intense discussions. This is where Karl truly begins to transform. He dives into philosophy, especially the works of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the thinker whose ideas dominate German academia. You sit beside Karl in a crowded lecture hall. the candles flickering as a professor explains Hegel's complex theories about history and reason. Karl listens intently, scribbling notes, his mind racing. He becomes part of a small circle known as the Young Hegelians, a group of students who twist Hegel's ideas toward radical conclusions. They question religion, monarchy, and the old order. Historians still debate whether Marx was already forming his revolutionary ideas here or merely testing the waters. What's certain is that he begins to see philosophy not as abstract thought, but as a tool to change the world. One little-known tidbit is that Karl was an incredible mimic. Friends recalled that he could imitate professors perfectly, even mocking Hegel's slow, heavy voice, turning complicated lectures into jokes that had everyone laughing. But behind the laughter, he absorbed every word, reshaping it into something new. You wander with him through the streets of Berlin, gray skies, horse carts clattering over stone roads, and the smell of coal in the air. The city feels alive with ideas, but also tense. Censorship is everywhere. Police spies attend university lectures, taking notes on which students might be too curious. Karl reads forbidden pamphlets by candlelight, his window covered to hide the glow. The more he reads, the more he's convinced that freedom of thought is worth any risk. He writes essays full of fire, questioning not just the government but religion itself. One professor warns him that such ideas could ruin his career before it even begins, but Karl doesn't care. He believes truth must be spoken, even if no one wants to hear it. You can sense that stubbornness building in him, a force that will one day both make and break him. As his studies near their end, his father dies suddenly. The loss hits Karl hard. The steady voice that once grounded him is gone. You can almost feel the silence that follows in his letters, the guilt, the longing. He throws himself into his work, reading for days without rest, scribbling in margins until his ink runs dry. By the time he finishes in Berlin, Karl Marx is no longer just a student, he's a thinker sharpening his pen for battle. The romantic poet of Trier has become a restless philosopher who believes that ideas can reshape society. As the evening air settles over Berlin, you watch him close his notebooks, the candle burning low beside him. He doesn't yet know where his path will lead, but the questions inside him are growing louder. The calm streets outside can't hide the quiet storm forming within this young man's mind. You find yourself walking along a quiet cobblestone path in the city of Trier again, but this time Karl is no longer the restless boy you met before. He's now a man in his 20s, his thoughts sharper, his heart heavier with ambition. The year is 1836, and in the midst of all his philosophical searching, something soft and luminous begins: his love for Jenny von Westphalen. Jenny is unlike anyone he's ever known. She's graceful, intelligent, and comes from a noble family that lives just a few doors away. You imagine her sitting by a window with sunlight touching her hair, reading poetry while the world outside moves slowly. Karl has admired her since childhood, but now, as adults, their connection deepens into something fierce and unshakable. He, the fiery young thinker, and she, the refined baron's daughter, fall in love against every rule of class and expectation. You can almost hear the soft rustle of paper as Karl writes her letter after letter, filled with longing, philosophy, and hope. In one, he calls her "my little Jenniken," a tender name that stays with them for life. Their letters are not just love notes, they're conversations about freedom, truth, and art. Historians still argue whether Jenny's influence helped shape Karl's ideas about equality and injustice. But there's little doubt she gave him something far rarer: peace. The romance is not easy. Her family disapproves. The von Westphalens want a future husband of rank and wealth, not a radical philosopher with more opinions than income. But Jenny, strong-willed and full of conviction, defends her love quietly but firmly. One quirky detail that people often overlook is that she secretly taught herself bits of philosophy just to keep up with Karl's long, passionate discussions. You can picture them walking along the river, debating ideas about the soul and society, unaware that their shared curiosity would later grow into something far larger than romance. Years pass before they can marry. Karl is determined to make something of himself first. He earns his doctorate in philosophy in 1841, presenting a dense and daring dissertation comparing to ancient Greek thinkers Democritus and Epicurus. The professors admire it, but the doors of academia remain closed to him. His radical reputation follows him everywhere, whispered about in faculty halls and government offices. Still, he doesn't give up. He tries to find work as a lecturer but soon learns that the universities of Prussia are no place for men who question the state or religion. Jenny waits patiently, though her family pressures her to end the engagement. The letters between them grow more emotional, full of hope and fear. You can almost hear the scratch of his pen late at night as he writes by candlelight, the ink smudged where he's pressed too hard. Their love becomes his anchor through uncertainty. By 1843, after 7 long years of waiting, Karl and Jenny finally marry. You stand with them in a small church in Kreuznach, where sunlight filters through colored glass and dust dances in the air. Their wedding is simple, almost secret, with few guests and no lavish celebration. Karl's friends can barely afford the trip, but those who come know they're re-witnessing something powerful: the union of two people who believe in both each other and in the idea that love should defy status. They spend their early married days dreaming of a better world. Karl works as a journalist now, writing fierce articles that challenge censorship and monarchy. He believes words can be weapons, and Jenny encourages him with gentle strength. The two live modestly, often short on money but never short on laughter. You see them sitting side by side at their small table, their baby daughter Jenny Caroline asleep nearby, while Karl reads aloud his latest article, his voice rising with conviction, but danger is never far. The authorities begin to notice his writings. His first newspaper, Rheinische Zeitung, becomes a voice for reform, criticizing the government for corruption and poverty. The paper grows in influence and in trouble. A well-known fact is that by 1843, the Prussian government shuts it down entirely. One official writes that Marx's articles sow dangerous ideas among the working class. You can sense Karl's frustration burning quietly. He feels both proud and trapped. He has the mind of a philosopher and the pen of a rebel, yet no place to call home. So he and Jenny make a bold decision. They leave Germany behind. Paris awaits, full of revolutionaries, writers, and the promise of freedom. Before they go, they walk one last time through Trier's old streets. You can almost feel the bittersweet air between them, the weight of leaving family, the excitement of what's ahead. Jenny holds his arm tightly, knowing this journey will not be easy. Karl looks at her, smiling through worry, and says softly that the world must be changed, and that every truth worth fighting for begins in discomfort. The carriage pulls away, the road stretching ahead like a question mark into the unknown. You watch the small town fade behind them, replaced by the endless possibility of the city of light and the coming storm that will test everything they believe in. You arrive in Paris with Karl and Jenny, the city humming with life and ideas. It's 1843, and the narrow streets smell of bread, smoke, and ink. Paris is alive in a way no German city has been. It's filled with poets, printers, revolutionaries, and dreamers. Here, Karl feels he can finally breathe. You can almost feel that excitement radiating from him as he walks through the Latin Quarter. His coat too thin for the chill, his pockets nearly empty, but his mind bursting with plans. He begins working for radical newspapers almost immediately. In his first apartment, the walls are lined with books, and the floor is covered with papers. He writes all day and late into the night, his pen scratching out ideas about freedom, justice, and power. Jenny helps him organize his drafts, her calm presence grounding his intensity. They have little money, but the city itself becomes their reward. Historians still argue whether it was Paris that transformed Marx from philosopher to revolutionary. What's certain is that this city gave him both fuel and fire. He spends hours in cafes filled with smoke and argument, listening to debates about socialism, labor, and revolution. One evening, amid the noise and laughter, a tall, confident man with a neatly trimmed beard enters. His name is Friedrich Engels. That meeting changes everything. Engels is the son of a wealthy industrialist from Manchester, but unlike most rich men, he despises the suffering that industry brings. He's seen the poor working in his father's factories, children coughing in dust, and men growing old before 30. He writes about it with compassion and anger, and when he meets Karl, he recognizes the same fire in him. The two talk all night, and by morning, a friendship has begun that will last a lifetime. A quirky detail few people know. When Marx and Engels met, they bonded instantly over jokes about philosophy. Engels later joked that Marx had the loudest laugh in Europe. You can imagine the sound echoing through that cramped cafe. Two young men laughing about the absurdities of life while quietly plotting to change it. Their partnership is both intellectual and emotional. Engels becomes more than a friend. He's Karl's lifeline when money runs out. Engels quietly sends funds. When ideas stall, Engels challenges him, pushing him further. Together, they begin to form a theory that will one day shake the world. Karl's writing becomes sharper, bolder. He publishes essays attacking monarchy and religion, calling them tools used to keep people obedient. One of his most famous lines from that time, "Religion is the opium of the people," appears in his 1844 work, a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. The phrase shocks even his allies. Historians still debate whether he meant to reject faith entirely or simply criticize how it was used by rulers to dull human pain. Meanwhile, life at home is difficult. You step inside their small Paris apartment and feel the damp air. The furniture is second-hand, the food simple. Karl spends more time reading and writing than eating. Jenny, ever patient, pawns her jewelry when rent is due. Their love remains strong, but poverty presses close. Yet Paris also offers warmth. The couple makes friends, among other exiles and thinkers. Heinrich Heine, the poet, visits often, teasing Karl about his serious face. They share coffee, bread, and laughter, though all of them know that police spies lurk nearby. The French government, nervous about growing radical movements, keeps close watch. One evening you walk with Karl along the Seine. The air is cold, and the city lights ripple on the water. He stops on a bridge, speaking softly to Jenny about how history is shaped by conflict, how one day the workers will rise and reclaim their lives. She listens, her gloved hand on his arm, knowing that the path ahead will not be easy, but feeling that this belief, This stubborn faith in justice is what makes him who he is. By 1845, the tension builds. Karl's articles draw attention from the Prussian government, which pressures France to silence him. Soon, officials come knocking. He's told to leave Paris. Jenny packs their few belongings without complaint, though her eyes show the strain. They move briefly to Brussels, where Karl continues his work under surveillance. Before leaving, Karl walks one last time through the narrow streets of Paris. You can almost sense what he's feeling, a mix of anger and quiet pride. The city gave him everything and took nothing back. His pen, once the tool of a poet, has become a weapon sharper than any sword. As the carriage rattles toward Belgium, Karl gazes out the window, his mind already on his next project. He doesn't know it yet, but the ideas he has been forming with Engels will soon become a manifesto that will echo through history, stirring revolutions and dividing nations. The night outside the carriage is dark, but in his eyes, you can still see the flicker of determination, burning like a lantern against the cold. You find yourself in Brussels now. In the year 1845, the city feels quieter than Paris, more reserved, with grey skies and tidy streets. Karl and Jenny settle into a small apartment on Rue d'Orléans. The rooms are bare, the rent barely affordable. Yet there's a strange peace here. For the first time in years, they're not running from police or censors. Still, exile always carries its own kind of loneliness. You can almost hear the echo of Karl's boots on the wooden floor as he paces back and forth, thinking, scribbling, rewriting. Karl begins to gather a circle of other exiled thinkers, men and women who share his hunger for change. They discuss everything from philosophy to poverty, from religion to revolution. The conversations stretched late into the night, punctuated by the crackling of candles and the sound of pens scratching paper. It's in this atmosphere that his partnership with Friedrich Engels truly blossoms. The two men spend hours in cafes and libraries, trading ideas, debating every sentence. Engels brings something Karl doesn't have first-hand knowledge of: factory life. He's seen workers in Manchester living in slums, families sleeping beside sewage drains, children losing fingers in machinery. Karl listens, fascinated and horrified, and begins shaping these stories into theory. Together they start to sketch out what they call scientific socialism, a framework they believe can explain how societies evolve through class struggle. Historians still argue whether this was the moment Marxism truly began. Some say it started earlier, in the cafes of Paris. Others insist it was here in Brussels, in those long nights of discussion, when philosophy turned into a movement. A well-known fact is that it was in Brussels that Marx and Engels wrote the German ideology, their first major collaboration. They never published it in their lifetimes, but the pages full of handwritten notes and fierce arguments laid the groundwork for everything that followed. You can almost feel the tension of those debates, Marx's voice rising, Engels laughing, the air thick with cigarette smoke and conviction. Karl is a perfectionist. He rewrites entire pages because one word doesn't feel right. Jenny helps copy the manuscripts, her hands smudged with ink, her eyes tired but proud. Still, life in Brussels is hard. Money remains scarce, and the authorities grow suspicious again. They warn Marx not to hold political meetings, but he ignores them. One quirky detail that few people know: Karl often hid his manuscripts in the oven whenever police were rumored to be near. He'd laugh about it later, saying his ideas were baked before they were read. Despite hardship, hope begins to grow. In 1847, Karl and Engels join an underground group called the League of the Just, a small secret society of German workers and exiles. The group's motto is simple but powerful: all men are brothers. They ask Karl and Engels to draft a statement of their beliefs, something clear and direct that could reach workers everywhere. The two men accept without hesitation. You sit beside them in that dimly lit room, papers scattered across the table. Outside, snow drifts against the window. Engels writes the first lines, Marx refines them. Slowly the words take shape. They call it the Communist Manifesto. The document is short, only about 20 pages, but its message is bold. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. You can feel the gravity of that sentence, like a bell ringing through history. Jenny watches as Karl reads the final version aloud. His voice is calm but charged with energy. He believes these words will outlive him. Historians still debate whether he realized just how much they would when the manifesto was published in early 1848. The timing couldn't be more dramatic. Revolutions erupt across Europe within weeks. Workers take to the streets in France, Germany and Italy, demanding rights and justice. The pamphlet spreads quietly at first, copied and smuggled from city to city, a whisper of defiance that soon becomes a roar. But as revolutions grow, governments crack down. In Brussels, Karl is arrested briefly and ordered to leave the country. Once again, exile calls. You can almost feel the exhaustion in him, the familiar ache of packing up, of saying goodbye to yet another city. Jenny gathers their belongings, the children bundled in coats. Engels promises to help them find safety in Cologne, then later in London. As their carriage rolls out of Brussels, The night air feels heavy with both defeat and promise. Karl gazes through the frost-covered window, watching the city fade behind him. He has no wealth, no stability, and yet there's something unbreakable in his eyes. The words he and Engels have written are now beyond their control. They've escaped the page and entered the world. The road ahead leads to London, a place that will test every part of him. Poverty will press harder than ever, and grief will shadow his days. But as the carriage wheels turn through the night, Karl leans his head back and closes his eyes. His life is already tied to something far larger than himself, a storm of ideas that will one day sweep across nations. London greets you not with grandeur, but with grandness. The year is 1849, and Karl Marx, now in his early 30s, steps onto the damp streets with Jenny and their 3 small children. The city hums with noise-horse carts rattling, factory whistles screaming, and the Thames rolling thick and brown under a low sky. They arrive with almost nothing, a few bags, a handful of books, and more dreams than coins. Their first home is cramped and dim, tucked in a poor part of Soho. The smell of coal smoke seeps through cracked windows, and the floors creak with every step. Rent is barely paid, food is scarce, and sickness hovers constantly. You can almost feel the cold dampness in the air, the way it clings to their clothes. Jenny tries to make their small space warm and livable, sewing by candlelight and comforting their children as Karl writes through the night. Despite the hardship, London becomes his base for the rest of his life. He spends his mornings in the reading room of the British Museum, a massive hall filled with quiet scholars and endless shelves of books. You can picture him there, his dark hair unkempt, his coat worn thin, a pile of papers beside him. Day after day, he pores over statistics, history, and economics, trying to understand how the world's wealth is produced and why so much of it remains in the hands of so few. A well-known fact is that it was here, in that great dome-shaped library, that Marx began drafting what would become Das Kapital, his most famous work. He would sit for hours, lost in thought, surrounded by silence, the scratching of pens, and the soft rustle of turning pages. Sometimes he'd forget to eat. When the library closed at dusk, he'd walk home under flickering gas lamps, deep in thought, already planning his next pages. Historians still argue whether Marx was more of a philosopher or an economist. What's certain is that London's poverty shaped his ideas as much as any book. He didn't need statistics to tell him about inequality. He lived it. He saw it daily in the faces of the poor, in the barefoot children playing in the mud outside his window. Jenny's health began to fail under the strain, and tragedy soon struck. Their son Edgar fell ill with bronchitis. The doctor demanded payment before visiting, but there was no money left. Karl ran from friend to friend, begging for help, but the child died in his arms before aid arrived. Jenny buried him in a pauper's grave because they couldn't afford a coffin. You can almost hear the quiet sobs that filled their small room that night, and the way Karl sat in silence afterward, staring at the wall, guilt heavy on his chest. He wrote later that poverty was not only hunger or cold, it was humiliation. One quirky detail that reveals his pride: even in his poorest days, Marx insisted on having Jenny dress properly whenever guests came. He said poverty could take their money but not their dignity. Through all this, Engels remained his anchor. Living in Manchester, Engels had a steady income from his family's textile business, though he despised the work. He sent Karl money whenever he could, sometimes pawning his own belongings to help the Marx family survive. Their friendship became a lifeline. Engels later joked that without him, Marx would have starved to death in the British Museum. Even in these dark years, Karl never stopped writing. His articles for European newspapers kept his ideas alive. He wrote about workers' rights, colonialism, and the failures of capitalism. His tone could be fierce, but beneath it lay compassion. He saw the pain of others as his own. Sometimes, though, the exhaustion broke through. You can imagine him walking along the Thames at night, his thoughts heavy, his coat pulled tight against the fog. London's lights blur in the mist, and for a moment, he looks small against the vastness of the city he hopes to change. Yet when he returns home, his resolve hardens again. Jenny meets him at the door, their surviving children asleep, and he whispers to her that their suffering will one day mean something. Historians still debate whether Marx ever lost faith during those years. Some say the constant hardship nearly broke him. Others believe it only deepened his conviction that the world could be fairer. What's undeniable is that the years in Soho forged both his mind and his heart. By the early 1850s, Karl begins to publish again. His essays on economics start to gain quiet attention among socialist circles. He continues to refine his great theory how history moves in cycles of struggle, how labor creates value, and how the system itself breeds inequality. He still dreams of a time when the workers of the world will unite. The Marx family eventually moves to a slightly better home in Kentish Town, thanks to Engels' steady support. Life remains difficult, but there are moments of light. You can see Karl smiling as his daughters run around the small garden, or hear him laughing loudly when Jenny teases him about his untidy beard. Still, the work consumes him. Late at night, the streets outside are silent, but in his study, the lamp still burns. He's surrounded by books, notes, and a constant sense that time is slipping away. He's chasing something vast, something that could explain the entire pattern of human life. The world outside may see only a poor exile, but in this quiet, messy room, Karl Marx is slowly building the foundation of an idea that will one day outlive him. By the mid-1850s, Karl Marx's routine in London becomes a rhythm of poverty and purpose. Each morning he rises early, often before dawn, and walks through the grey streets toward the British Museum. The city is waking slowly, vendors shouting, horses clattering, fog rising from the cobblestones. He arrives at the great circular reading room, nods to the guards, and takes his usual seat under the dome. The smell of ink and old paper fills the air. Here, he becomes a ghost among thinkers. For hours he moves between books, recording data, tracing patterns, searching for the hidden mechanism that drives society. He studies factory reports, economic surveys, and histories of trade. His notes sprawl across pages, dense, meticulous, feverish. Those around him barely notice him, a silent man in a worn coat with eyes that seem to look through time. At home, Jenny waits with the children. She tries to stretch what little money they have, boiling potatoes, sewing clothes from scraps, patching boots with string. She sometimes sells her belongings to pay the butcher. Yet through all this, her faith in Karl doesn't falter. She writes to a friend, "He suffers for humanity, and I suffer with him." Still, there are days when despair wins. Their second child dies, another victim of poverty and illness. Jenny falls ill again. The landlord knocks for rent they don't have. Marx himself develops painful boils on his skin, a cruel irony, as if the world itself rejects his restless body. But amidst the grief, a strange strength forms. Marx begins to see his personal suffering as part of the same structure he's writing against. The system that leaves millions hungry, that measures human worth by profit, it has shaped his own pain. It becomes fuel for his work. In 1859, he publishes a contribution to the critique of political economy, his first major attempt to formalize his theory. It goes largely unnoticed, but within it lies the foundation for Das Kapital. He knows the great book will take years to complete. Engels encourages him constantly, writing letters filled with humor and money, urging him to keep going. "You are making history," Engels says, though neither of them can imagine just how true that will become. A fascinating detail from this period. Despite his struggles, Marx adored his children. He nicknamed his eldest daughter Jenniken "my little general." He played chess with them, told long bedtime stories filled with pirates and revolutions, and often acted out characters with theatrical flair. Friends who visited were surprised to find the great theorist laughing loudly on the floor with his daughters. Yet outside their small home, his name begins to spread quietly. His articles in the New York Tribune bring him a modest income and connect him to readers across the Atlantic. He writes about European politics, colonial oppression, and economic injustice with sharp precision. Some of his essays predict that the tensions of capitalism will eventually erupt into crisis, a vision that feels prophetic to later generations. The 1860s bring a slow but steady change. The Marx family moves to a more comfortable home in Haverstock Hill. There is finally some warmth, some peace. Engels' fortunes improve, and he sends regular support. Marx's daughters grow into intelligent, fiery young women, all deeply influenced by their father's ideas. The family's evenings are filled with debate, laughter, and reading aloud from Goethe or Shakespeare. Still, Das Kapital remains his obsession. He writes, rewrites, and destroys drafts in frustration. "I am plowing the sea," he once said. The scale of what he's attempting, the anatomy of the entire economic system, is immense. He knows that if he gets it wrong, his life's work will collapse. He drinks strong coffee late into the night, pacing his study, muttering to himself. His health worsens, but he refuses to stop. "Time," he writes in a letter, "is the space in which I must live and die for my idea." In 1867, after nearly 2 decades of struggle, Das Kapital Volume 1 is finally published in Hamburg. When the first copy arrives in London, Marx holds it in his hands for a long time. The book is thick, dense, uncompromising. He knows it will not be easy for the world to digest. But it is the work of his life, the map of the machine he believes drives all of modern civilization. The reviews are mixed. Some call it brilliant, others unreadable. It sells slowly, but in small socialist circles, in labor clubs and study groups, the name Karl Marx begins to gain gravity. His words become scripture for those who dream of a more equal world. Jenny weeps with pride when she sees the finished book. "You have conquered," she tells him. Marx smiles, but only faintly. He knows this is just the beginning. Volumes 2 and 3 still await, and his health grows worse by the day. But for the first time he feels a quiet certainty. His ideas have left his hands. They now belong to time. When he returns to the British Museum, the familiar dome seems warmer. He sits at his old table, surrounded by papers, and begins again. He is still chasing the same question, the one that has haunted him since his youth. Why does the labor of so many enrich only a few? And can humanity ever break free from that ancient chain? The years after Das Kapital's publication settle into a heavy calm. Karl Marx continues to live in London, the city he both curses and depends on. His fame is modest, but among the growing movements of workers in Europe, his ideas begin to bloom like wildflowers breaking through concrete. In factories, in meeting halls, in whispered discussions between laborers, people quote his words. They don't always understand every theory, but they feel the truth of it deep in their bones. You watch him walk through the foggy streets again, now older, slower, carrying the weight of both triumph and fatigue. His coat is patched at the elbows, his beard has grown grey and wild. Inside his home, piles of papers cover every surface. He mutters to himself as he works, occasionally pausing to rub his aching eyes or to sip bitter tea that Jenny has set beside him. The work never stops. Volumes 2 and 3 of *Das Kapital* remain incomplete, tangled in endless drafts. Marx fills notebooks with calculations, quotes, and fragments of thought. His handwriting grows shakier, his ideas even more ambitious. He dreams of finishing the series as a total portrait of the capitalist system, a structure built on profit and pain, destined to collapse under its own contradictions. Historians still argue whether Marx knew his health was failing during these years or if he simply refused to believe it. He begins suffering from lung infections, insomnia, and chronic pain. At times, his daughters begged him to rest, but he laughs it off, saying that a man cannot die while unfinished work sits on his desk. Engels remains his constant friend and lifeline. Their letters are full of affection and wit. Engels jokes about Marx's endless editing, while Marx teases him about his more practical nature. It's a friendship built on both intellect and loyalty. Engels often sends money, ensuring that Marx's family can stay afloat. Without him there would be no home, no books, no warmth. A small but charming fact: Marx had a strange habit of pacing while writing. He would walk around the room, muttering whole passages aloud before setting them to paper. His children would sit quietly and listen, sometimes giggling at his intensity. They remember him as both fierce and tender a father who believed in justice but also in bedtime stories and laughter. By the early 1870s, the world begins to change in ways Marx had predicted. Revolutions flicker across Europe. The Paris Commune of 1871, the brief uprising of workers who seized control of the city, fills Marx with both pride and sorrow. He calls it the glorious harbinger of a new society, even though it is crushed in blood. The failure haunts him, but it also strengthens his belief that the struggle of the working class is inevitable and global. He writes *The Civil War in France*, defending the Commune and its fighters. The essay is sharp, emotional, and deeply human. For the first time, his ideas are not just theory, they are history. The workers of Europe see him not as a philosopher in exile, but as a comrade who understands their fight. Jenny, though still devoted, begins to fade. Her health worsens from years of stress and poor living conditions. Their daughters care for her tenderly. Marx, despite his exhaustion, sits by her bed each night, reading aloud until she falls asleep. When she dies in December 1881, he is shattered. Friends recall that he walked the streets of London for hours in silence, unable to speak. 2 years later, tragedy strikes again. His eldest daughter, Jenniken, dies suddenly. The loss breaks what remains of his strength. He writes to Engels that life now feels like a dark night with no dawn, and yet, even in grief, he continues to work. He travels to the south of France and to Algiers, seeking relief for his failing lungs. The sun, the sea, the strange warmth of foreign air brings him brief comfort. He sits on balconies overlooking the Mediterranean, his papers scattered by the wind, still writing, still thinking. Locals see him as a quiet old scholar with sad eyes. Back in London, the world he once dreamed of transforming is stirring again. The First International, a coalition of socialist and labor groups, spreads his influence further. Workers in England, Germany, and beyond begin to identify themselves as Marxists. It's a strange feeling for him. He never sought personal fame, and he sometimes criticizes those who quote him without truly understanding. "I am not a Marxist," he jokes once, frustrated by those who turn his ideas into rigid dogma. But he cannot deny what he has set in motion. The theories he began scribbling decades ago in the British Museum now circled the globe. People write to him from America, Russia, and Asia. His name has become a quiet beacon for the poor, the laborer, and the dreamer. One evening, he sits in his study surrounded by his daughters, Laura and Eleanor. The fire burns low. They talk softly about Jenny, about old memories, about the book that changed everything. Eleanor places her hand on his arm and says, "Your words will outlive us all." He smiles faintly and replies, "Words are nothing without people to live them." It's a small moment, but it captures the man perfectly. Karl Marx was never chasing glory. He was chasing understanding and explanation for the world's unfairness and a vision for how it might one day be repaired. When he finally puts down his pen that night, he looks out the window. London hums softly under the fog, lamps flickering in the distance. He whispers something to himself, a thought too private to record, and closes his eyes for a moment of rest. The next morning, he returns to his desk. The cycle continues, writing, revising, coughing, dreaming. The fight between body and mind, between exhaustion and purpose, will not end easily. He is, after all, still the man who refused to surrender to comfort while injustice remained. The winter of 1882 drags on heavily. You find Karl Marx back in London, frail but determined, his body betraying him even as his mind refuses to slow. The house feels emptier now without Jenny's soft voice or Jennikin's laughter. Only the ticking clock, the crackle of the fire, and the scratching of his pen break the silence. He still writes, though his handwriting has become unsteady. Notes for Das Kapital Volume 2 and 3 scatter across the table like fallen leaves. His youngest daughter Eleanor now takes on the role of assistant and caretaker. She helps him sort through the mountain of papers, copying passages, deciphering his fading script, and keeping him company during long, sleepless nights. His health is fragile. Chronic bronchitis, pleurisy, and liver trouble keep him confined to bed for days at a time. The boils that once covered his skin return occasionally, painful and relentless. Yet, when visitors arrive, they still see flashes of the old Marx's sharp wit, his biting humor, his booming laugh. He often jokes about death, calling it just another bureaucrat who has yet to process my file. He remains connected to Engels through letters filled with warmth and respect. Engels, now more prosperous from his business dealings, continues to support him financially and emotionally. The two men talk about finalizing the later volumes of Das Kapital*, but Marx can no longer sustain the long hours of focus he once had. He dictates thoughts instead, as Eleanor transcribes. Historians still argue whether Marx was fully aware of how influential he had become by these years. He certainly knew his work was being discussed and debated, but he never lived to see the scale of it. Labor movements across Europe began quoting the Communist Manifesto as a kind of gospel. In Germany, socialist parties rose, demanding reform. In Russia, revolutionaries whispered his name like a promise. But in his quiet London home, Marx remained almost indifferent to fame. He told a visitor, "I care not for monuments, I care for movement." Despite his frailty, he still loved small joys. He adored his grandchildren, often letting them climb onto his lap to tug at his beard while he pretended to be a grumpy giant. He took short walks when the weather allowed, wrapped tightly in an old scarf, watching London's smoke drift into the sky. He found strange beauty in the ordinary, the way lamplight shimmered on wet cobblestones, or how children's laughter echoed through narrow streets. In the evenings, friends gathered to discuss politics and philosophy. Marx would sit by the fire, a blanket over his legs, and argue passionately about new developments in Europe. Sometimes, he grew frustrated at how people misused his theories, simplifying them into slogans. Ideas, he once said, should never sleep. They must be challenged every morning like the sun. Eleanor, often called Tussie, became his brightest companion. She had inherited both his intellect and his fire. She translated his works, attended socialist meetings, and fiercely defended him from critics. He trusted her completely, telling friends, "She is the best part of me." But as the months pass, his energy fades. In early 1883, he travels briefly to the seaside town of Ventnor on the Isle of Wight, hoping the sea air will ease his lungs. The ocean's vast calm soothes him for a while. He sits by the water, watching the waves roll endlessly, perhaps thinking about how his own life has been another tide rising, breaking, retreating, yet always in motion. When he returns to London, his condition worsens rapidly. He can no longer eat properly. Sleep comes in short bursts. He drifts in and out of memory. Stryer, Bonn, Jenny, Paris, Engels, the reading room, the children's laughter. Everything feels like fragments of one long sentence. On March 14, 1883, Eleanor finds him sitting in his chair, his head gently tilted to the side, a quiet expression on his face. His pen rests on the table beside an open notebook. There is no struggle, no sound, only stillness. Karl Marx is gone. He is buried 3 days later in Highgate Cemetery. Only about a dozen people attend the small funeral, standing under a grey London sky. Engels delivers a brief but powerful speech. His name, he says softly, will endure through the ages. And so will his work. The wind carries the words through the bare trees, as if the city itself pauses to listen. Years later, his tomb will become a place of pilgrimage. Thousands will visit from every corner of the world, workers, thinkers, students, dreamers, leaving flowers, coins, or handwritten notes at the base of his grave. But in this moment, it is simple, almost tender. The man who gave his life to understanding the struggles of others rests quietly in the soil of the same industrial world he sought to transform. Eleanor remains devoted to preserving his legacy. She helps Engels edit and publish the later volumes of Das Kapital, ensuring that her father's work reaches completion. Engels calls her Marx's truest heir. Together they make sure his ideas do not fade with his death. And so, even as London continues its endless rhythm, factory bells ringing, trains shrieking, streets bustling, there is a subtle shift in the air. The ideas, born in exile, shaped in hunger and pain, begin to drift outward like seeds on the wind. Somewhere in a crowded workshop, a young laborer reads Marx for the first time. Somewhere in a dim library, a student begins to question power. The man himself is gone, but his questions, his anger, his hope, they are very much alive. The years following Karl Marx's death in 1883 are quiet for the man himself, yet the world hums with the echoes of his ideas. You wander through London's streets, imagining how the smoke-filled factories, the crowded neighborhoods, and the bustling docks seem unchanged, but beneath the surface, something new has begun. His words ripple outward, carried by workers, writers, and thinkers across continents. The seeds he planted grow slowly, often in ways he never anticipated. Eleanor and Engels worked tirelessly to complete and publish Das Kapital Volumes 2 and 3, preserving Karl's meticulous notes. You can picture them in that small London flat, surrounded by mountains of scribbled manuscripts, rewriting passages, correcting calculations, and ensuring that his vision remains intact. Each sentence carries the weight of decades of thought, struggle, and suffering. The process is exhausting, yet also a labor of love. Every time a volume is completed, it feels like Karl himself is whispering gratitude from beyond. Historians still debate the impact of Marx's death on his work. Did his absence alter the trajectory of socialism? Could he have guided future movements differently if he had lived longer? What is undeniable is that his ideas had already taken root. Workers in Europe, Asia, and the Americas begin organizing. Inspired by the manifesto and the volumes of economic theory he left behind, the notion that labor is the source of value, that the oppressed might one day rise, spreads quietly yet persistently, like a river carving its course through stone. You imagine Karl's daughters carrying on his legacy. Eleanor throws herself into activism, public speaking, and organizing, while Laura keeps their personal memories alive. Through their dedication, Marx's theories move beyond the pages of books and into the daily lives of ordinary people. You can almost hear the hum of distant factories and workshops as laborers discuss fairness, wages, and solidarity, small quiet revolutions of thought happening across the globe. One little-known tidbit. Marx kept a collection of small, hand-drawn caricatures, often mocking politicians, bureaucrats, and even himself. Friends discovered these sketches after his death and laughed, realizing that even the man who reshaped history had a mischievous, human side. It's a reminder that beyond theory, beyond ideology, he was also a father, a friend, a man who laughed and wept in equal measure. The London he walked in life continues without pause, fog drifting along the Thames, street lamps flickering, the distant clatter of trains, but now it carries a new dimension. Ideas once confined to cafes, cramped apartments, and manuscript pages have begun to take on a life of their own. They spread quietly, sometimes violently, often misunderstood, but always persistent. You can feel the faint hum of future movements, echoes of strikes, debates, pamphlets, and speeches that Karl himself could only dream of in his study. Marx's personal struggles, poverty, illness, loss fade into memory. What endures is the framework he built, a lens to examine society, to question inequality, and to imagine a world shaped not by profit, but by justice. His life was a mixture of intellect and emotion, of exile and family, of despair and hope. Every hardship, every argument with a friend or critic, every quiet evening in a damp London room all contributed to the life that left a mark far larger than one man could carry. As you walk away from Highgate Cemetery in your mind, you see the rows of stones and trees bathed in soft afternoon light. The world continues its steady rhythm, indifferent yet intimate, and somewhere, perhaps a young student opens a copy of the Communist Manifesto for the first time. Somewhere, a worker shares an idea inspired by his writing. His presence is gone, but the life he lived, the questions he raised, and the courage to challenge injustice remain. And so, Karl Marx's journey ends not in fame or fortune, but in the quiet perpetuation of ideas that outlast him. The man who spent decades in exile, who knew hunger and grief, who loved and lost, leaves behind a legacy of thought and hope, a legacy that reminds us softly but insistently that the world can be understood, questioned, and perhaps in time made fairer. Now, you let your pace slow. Imagine Karl Marx's life as a river, winding through streets of Trier, cafes of Paris, and foggy alleys of London, carrying both joy and sorrow, thought and struggle. You feel the weight of all he endured, the poverty, the loss of children, the illnesses, the exile, and the resilience that carried him forward. Each step, each letter, each argument with Engels or Jenny, shaped not only his mind but also the world. The rooms he lived in, modest and crowded, echo softly with memory. You can almost hear the scratch of his pen, the whisper of turning pages, the gentle laughter of his daughters, the quiet sighs of Jenny as she comforted their children. The world outside moved relentlessly, yet inside those walls, ideas were born and nurtured, fragile yet strong, like seedlings growing in winter. Even in death he is not absent. His thoughts continue to ripple through history, inspiring debates, movements, and questions about fairness and justice. You feel the lingering presence of a man who never sought personal glory but devoted himself entirely to understanding and explaining the structures that shape human lives. His journey reminds you that a single life, lived with intensity and integrity, can leave a mark far beyond its own time. As you settle deeper into your chair or bed, the images of his life fade gently into the soft hum of night. You hear the distant clatter of London streets, the murmur of cafes, the laughter and tears of a family bound by love and ideas. And with that, a calm reflection arises. Life is fleeting, Struggles are many, but courage, thought, and love leave a trace that endures quietly, persistently, like a soft glow in the dark. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let the story drift with you. Let the journey of Karl Marx, his trials, his family, and his ideas carry you into a gentle, thoughtful sleep.